If you're looking for your next lens as a beginner, you're probably wondering, what's a good lens that can capture my everyday life moments and is better or even complementary to what I have now? Well, in this video, we have the Sirui 23mm f1.2, which is something fast, sharp, and beginner friendly for a good price. Sirui did send me out this lens for a review, but they are not directly sponsoring this video. Well, first things first. The build quality. It feels pretty solid in the hand, it's metal to touch, or at least metal all around, but it's not too heavy, coming in at 380 grams, which is slightly heavier than other APS-C 23mm lenses. But that's a trade-off that we can overlook when it's got an aperture of f1.2, which pretty much means it lets a lot of light in. Size-wise, it does have a pretty good balance when it comes to attaching it to your camera. And if we consider 23mm as APS-C, when we compare it to full frame equivalents, we would have to multiply 23 times 1.5 because of the size of the sensor that this will cover. And you're getting more like a 35mm equivalent, which is the standard, or at least the most versatile of focal lengths that anybody can use. It's wide enough to use for storytelling, yet also tight enough to use for natural looking portraits. Now that we know what it feels like in the hand, let's see how it performs. Now you can basically use this to capture everyday life, whether it's things around your house or even just outside or perhaps at church, which is what I did. But I ended up taking this lens also to the park where I took some portraits of my wife, and she actually took some of me. If you're not shooting in auto and you keep this thing at f1.2 in your aperture, you will notice that the center of the image is going to be decently sharp, and maybe the contrast is a little bit lower, giving you a slightly dreamy look. But as we start to stop down our aperture to like f2 or f2.8, then we start to see more improvement in our sharpness overall from the center to the edges. Of course, you could always stop down more like to f4 or f5.6, especially when you're shooting in the middle of the day where you have lots of light. Now, normally when you shoot with a wide open aperture at f1.2, you're gonna expect some bokeh, especially when you get closer from the lens to your subject, now as minimum focus distance, as close as it can focus. And you're gonna get a lot of dreamy looking, blurry background, and that looks great. But of course, the farther that you get away, there's gonna be a little bit less of that. So if you're looking to get a bokeh-licious background, just make sure to check your frame and make sure it's not too busy so that you can have nice, pleasing colors and elements in the back for your subject. Overall, the colors are looking nice and neutral with some contrast as you continue to stop down. For the times that I did have the up-close f1.2 bokeh-licious background, I did find that it was pleasing to my eye. Although one caveat is that as you look at the background, yes, it's nice and pleasing and creamy. But on the edges of the frame, you'll notice that there are like shadows in the corners. If you're okay with that, then hey, cool. But if not, then perhaps you want to go ahead and stop down your aperture to like f2, f2.8. As a beginner, one of the first things I love doing was just opening up my aperture as wide as I could. But when it comes to catching things in focus, you actually want to stop things down. And usually around f2.8 is like the sweet spot where you can still catch a lot of focus, still have a balance of good sharpness, avoiding vignetting, and you can capture what you need to show. You can get your portraits, your headshots, maybe a couple product shots from a decent minimum focus. Fortunately, whether you're shooting at f1.2 or f11, you're getting a lot of good autofocus performance in between. And not just for photo, but also for video. Usually autofocus is going to be one of the biggest concerns when you use third-party lenses. And I'm using this for the Sony E-mount system. The focus is fast, it's sticky, especially when you consider how well the Sony autofocus system works, and it's reliable. Whether I'm using this for portraits or I'm using this for video, it just locks onto the people's faces and eyes consistently in all my experience. Even in low light, when I was using this in church, it held up pretty well. And sometimes, maybe there was even slight hesitation before locking in on focus, which is kind of common in third-party lenses. But once you lock in on your subject, the autofocus is pretty much sticky from there. The thing to notice when shooting video, when you're just popping into frame, there will be a quick like focus hunt where it's like, I guess if that's how I would describe it. But anyway, there's like some focus breathing where it has like a slight shifting of the frame when refocusing. So that's a little bit jarring. But again, once you got your subject locked in, it's pretty good. I tried to use it with my friends playing pickleball, but I also used it in church where I was just tracking to see, oh, you could just follow simple movements while on the stage or in the front of the church. If you want to try to dial in more of your focus through manual control, you can do that. but just know that this lens does not have any autofocus switch to turn off and on like other lenses, or any programmable buttons. It's only the focus ring out here. Because this thing can open up its aperture so wide, it's going to be quite variable in low light situations. So instead of having to crank up your ISO to like say 3200 or whatever, well, you can go ahead and just open up your aperture to f1.2 and be able to just get a much more pleasing image without having to introduce noise. Now do try this out yourself with this lens, because yes, as much light as you get with f1.2, you also want to find that balance of finding a good pleasing image because of things like vignetting, which you don't have as much because of the 16:9 ratio of video versus like a 3:2 ratio when you're normally taking photos. Also do note that when you do have vignetting in photos, you can correct that in post, like in Lightroom. But before we wrap things up, let's go over the key things to consider before buying something like this. At $299, this lens offers a lot for a fast f1.2 aperture, as well as having a solid autofocus and great image quality. If you're looking into getting into portrait photography, this is a good lens to start out with. But if you want a tighter focal length, then you may have to go something higher than a 23. Perhaps something like 56mm is somewhere where the range of where you want to go. And Sirui does make a lens for that too, especially if you want to stop to f1.2 for an aperture. Is having a zoom lens important to you? Well, most people start off with the Sony kit lens, which is a zoom lens from 16 to 50mm, which is pretty good. But the thing is, you don't have a wide open aperture that this thing can provide. So if you're willing to give up a little bit of zoom and just have a lens that doesn't zoom at all, then this is something that you want to start practicing with. And if you do need to zoom with this lens, then you're just gonna have to zoom with your feet. Overall, if you want an affordable, fast, prime lens for portraits and everyday use, this is a great choice. But hey, if you're looking for other budget lenses, then check these out over here.